I spent the most time editing book 3, I think, of all the books. And that's basically like in contrast to like book 2, where I basically said like changed the most content in that book. But book 3 is basically the one I basically spent the most time like, scrutinizing and stuff like that. Trying to get the wording just right for you guys, so there'll be less complaints about like, the story from that, like, part of the lore. Alright, so Escapades of Fay Willows. Now, I'll note that when I was basically like, starting to write this like, lore out, I was of course basically part of like the Spider DLC team at that time. And I was basically like, delving a little bit and like, writing some lore basically for the Spider campaign. During a key aspect to like that campaign, one of the ideas that was basically like, going to happen was basically like the Spider King would basically go to Maj'Eyal via sort of like, black market store portal. And you'd be able to like interact with like, the dozens of Maj'Eyal for that little like, specific point of the game. And of course, that means like, there's going to be lore for that specific point of the game. Now, I'm not that ultimately the Spider DLC is not going to be a thing, but this lore was basically a thing that basically got added to the game from that DLC. And I'll note that basically I was like, specifically writing this for like, that little instance, but whatever, it basically got to the DLC via variant gults, so that's just how it went. Now, I basically was like, writing it specifically at that point. Part of the reason I basically started to like, write this is because we didn't have any lore for the Florin, for the Menders, stuff like that. And that's basically my like sort of initial like, inkling basically to start writing the story out. It's basically to try to like, fill in the gaps basically of like, lore we didn't really have for the world. And I'll note that another thing I basically keep in mind here is that like, I basically wrote it from like the aspect of like, a sort of village girl basically, so to speak. But that's like, really like structuring it. She's like really like, a backward hick, like, in the fairest terms, so to speak, of what she basically was. Plus she's basically Florin, and as I described them, they're very introverted and like, separate from each other. So unless they basically have some need like to basically, employ, they probably like don't know how to write like any of them. Which is kind of laughable because they have a library, but whatever. Anyhow, I'll note that the term Fay, or the word like, the first name I basically have, Fay Willows here. Fay is actually a common name basically. They can actually like call your children. It's basically for like, female children to be exact. And of course, like, Fay basically means fairy in like, Old English. And that basically tied into like, the flora a little bit because they're basically woodland creatures, right? So Fay is like a fairy, Fay is in a floor. And she's female, so why not? It fits. And I ran with it. That's basically where this like thing basically came from. Now, I'll note that basically in like regards to like, running up this lore, I initially didn't actually plan for it to be like cursed like from the get-go. And I was basically sort of like, mulling over basically like, what sort of like, character class she might be, because I did have a plan to actually have her like, fight stuff. I'll note that it's very possible that I may like, ignored making her cursed to actually make her a Sol's Fist. Basically a psionic character instead of like, an inflicted one. And of course this basically ties into the fact that basically she's in the Heart of Gloom. It's worth knowing that the Heart of Gloom is basically like, always included like from the start of like this like, write-up, because that's basically always intended. But if you basically like, know about like, the story here for like, the Age of Ascendancy campaign, the Heart of Gloom can be either like, its cursed like, variation, which is basically the initial one, or it can be like, its alternate one, which is basically like, a dream state sort of thing. So a Sol's Fist could basically easily like be, sat in there, so to speak, for, playing the game. I was dead set basically on using an inflicted or psionic character, by the way, because we didn't really have a sort of like, iteration in the lore of such a character being used. Now, ultimately, I think around like book 2, I basically decided she's probably gonna be cursed. That's basically why you basically saw me use the Psionic Slaver in like, Psionic Trickery over here. And it's really around that point that basically I decided like, I'll basically start making a curse. So that's why basically where like, chapter 3 basically sort of like, headed in that direction. And then after like, I came back to like, my make like a first copy, I decided like, okay, let's just make her like, start to show off her cursed powers basically from like, book 1, chapter 1, so to speak. Which is probably basically how like the halfling getting killed. Now, to sort of like touch on like a fact here, I did intend for this to be like a sort of like poorly written sort of like, story, because it is like from like a sort of like humble like, sort of writer. But at the same time, that is also more of like an excuse than like, anything else for like how it basically got submitted. Although they basically ran out of time when I basically like, made this story. Basically the Freeman Cult is basically gonna go up, and Dark God basically wanted a story to basically put in, so he got the first copy basically at that point. And that's not only how I basically intended to basically like, sort of write this story up. I did intend to actually like, flesh it out a little bit more so it didn't have as bad like, as wording in basically, so it'd be at least readable. And even I know it was not like, readable, just from like, from its like entry into the game. But the main reason I was like, was actually writing this basically in the first place, just so you guys know. The thing about Fay Willows' Escapades is that it's supposed to be written for world-building purposes. Like, it's basically supposed to show you, like, what the, like, events were basically happening at the time of, like, the spell hunt. What were the zingers basically like? What was happening to the ogres basically, like, as soon as the spell hunt basically happened. With the zinger, perhaps, I'll say. And, I think for most parts, like, the story itself is not bad for that sort of thing. Some people might complain about, like, how book 3 basically sort of, like, takes them out, but for the most part, basically establishes, like, what was basically sort of happening. Well enough, I think. Now, I'll note something as well, by the way. I did have a sort of, like, inclination to, like, add in, like, little bits of, like, pieces of, like, of ideas. And, of course, basically, like, to go back to, like, again, my, like, go-to example. We basically have, like, the like Midville Plains be like referenced basically in like chapter 1 of like book 3 again, and here we're basically sort of like seeing the outcome of like what it basically says is like the land of like under the Noloran like lands there. It basically is like shot up through the middle of the continent of Maj'Eyal from like this point of time. All right, so one more thing I basically should probably point out here. I'll note that basically I've sort of written this a little bit differently now, so that basically we have like, a different text basically showing off right here. I'm not sure if like, Dark can actually do that in this game, but if he can, and basically the idea of like, this chapter and really the entire story basically at large. One thing to basically sort of keep in mind here is that basically Faye's supposed to be an unreliable, writer. And you're basically supposed to decide like, for yourself, like, how reliable you should basically be taking in like, some of this like information. I'll note for a good example basically up here. We have like, the Ziggler basically using fire to like, kill off the like, the mages. And the thing about like, chapter 4 of course is that it basically conflicts with like, the Spellhunter's Guide. So did the Ziggler basically like, write that guide basically after like, the events of this, or is that guide like, she actually taking the Spellhunter's Guide basically as like, being unreliable as a thing? That's basically how you should basically work it out in your head. So like, what's basically sort of happening in terms of like, how you should be reading this lore. And that's basically by design as a thing. The thing about like, Faye is that she's supposed to be like, unreliable in the sense that basically she might be exaggerating, or she might be like, shall we say like, massaging the story a little bit for like, her own purposes. Like, it's basically supposed to be like, how you look at Hollywood, for example. The events might be based on a story, but they may not have like happened that exact way. Is the idea. Now, I suppose there's one more thing I should actually know as well, by the way, and that's basically about like the Heart of Gloom basically like the spell is basically caused to be cursed. I'll note that basically with like the Heart of Gloom, I felt like you need to have like some like sort of like, something basically happened that basically caused to be cursed. And you obviously like explain this like why it's basically like you're a cursed state or basically like a dream state. And I think this lore basically sort of works well to sort of like examine that like something bad basically happened to the Heart of Gloom. Basically like because of Spellblaze it was like you're cursed or warped, I guess. Some people have like said that maybe it's like a book or something that's basically like doing it, but I didn't think that'd be like a good example for like what basically happens, especially since we now have like the alternate basically there. So I think the spell basically works better as like a explainer as to like what basically happened right there. And at the same time, basically, this could be again like it could have been written differently. So I could have like written this to be like more like a dreamy type of thing where she's like dreaming at this like it's basically all happening. So that could have been like what would have happened for her if I basically took her into Sonic route. Now, I'll note by the way the reason I didn't actually make her like a solve this in like the long run, it's really because I didn't really have enough like experience basically playing like the Solvus class or Mind Slayers or anything else like that. I played the Curse class before, and I think I played Doomed as well, but with like with this story, I want to basically go like something I basically knew, so I played the Curse before, so I went with that. Curse is probably one of the most like ingrained characters in my like head, so to speak. So yeah, it works. All right, so we're just gonna put a quick cut in here. I'll basically jump into like some of the specific information that I basically had for like some events basically here. All right, I'll note this is gonna be an addendum to like this video you're basically seeing right here, but I actually have like already basically gone through like a little bit of, like the lore bits for like books 1, 2, and 3, and I'll probably be releasing it along with this video this time around. But for most part, the one thing I didn't really discuss that like really need to is the idea of like Fay Willows being a Mary Sue. Now, I'll note that basically Fay Willows here, she was basically inspired by like the likes of like Rey from like Star Wars, Michael Burnham from like Star Trek Discovery, and a slew of like various animes that basically had come out at this time. And for most part, yeah, you could actually say like she is basically sort of based on Mary Sue's. But as much as she is like described as one, I guess, in this book, she wasn't actually intended to actually be like entirely like a full blown like Mary Sue, I guess we'll say. I'm not the one who basically got to like book 3 here. The idea basically sort of have for like Faye is that she'd be like sort of a Messiah character. And I guess like the best like contrast to her would be like Moses from like the Bible, or like Naruto from like the anime Naruto. And the idea here is that like essentially like Faye's basically here sort of lead these ogres basically out to like over to like Elvia, and establish basically how like the like ogres basically get to like that corner of like the Maj'Eyal map. And I guess like during like the sort of like chapters 4, 5, and 6, she basically sort of shows off like her comic prowess, and it's a little bit like overblown, I guess we'll say. Now, to some extent, like chapters 4, 5, and 6 are supposed to be like out of context, which is basically why like I went down and like changed this all to be like different text. It's to highlight the fact that basically like you shouldn't be like taking this like entirely at face value. There's something wrong basically with it, even though it's sort of describing like the battle that basically sort of possibly happened here. Now, the thing about like Faye being a Messiah character, this is basically always intended basically for it to basically happen in this book for her. Going back to book 1 basically here, when I basically like was saying like I tend to like write this bit like Flora and about Menders and stuff like that. Faye was basically going to be like a Messiah type of character for like the Menders from like the very get go. I just basically changed it so instead of like her being like a Messiah for Menders, she instead became a Messiah for the ogres instead. And I think it was basically like it's still worked basically for like the story, so sort of perspective to sort of explain like how the ogres basically got over to Elvia in the first place, or at least like lay the groundwork basically for it to get there. But I'll note basically like in regards to, like, to the criticism of her being a Mary Sue, I did actually sort of like go and like read a lot of the stuff basically like chapter 3 to sort of like lessen the impact a little bit. I didn't specifically do anything to chapters 4, 5, and 6 by the way, because well, besides the fact that basically changed like the text to be like a different like typeface, I didn't really actually feel like this is actually the problem like her the criticism basically for her being a Mary Sue. Rather basically came from like the little bits like this where I had like by this point in life I had never seen an actual battle, let alone a power one. And this is actually very much true for Faye, but it really needed me to sort of like highlight as to like how she basically had the combat abilities to sort of like fight against a halfling, I guess we'll say. Now, partly it's because she's like cursed, and because the curse basically had like, you know, unnatural abilities, the halfling just couldn't react to it basically easily. But some of the things I basically sort of did here, I actually went down to like, you know, book 4 here basically, I guess we'll say. And when I basically go into like chapter 6 to like, you know, show off her gamer skills, I'm basically gonna highlight the fact that basically like, you know, down here, when she's actually talking to Shalorn, she actually like, you know, gets a rudimentary refresher as opposed to like, you know, being taught how to wield like weapons of all types. And the idea here is basically like, you know, she actually knows how to actually use weaponry and like, you know, stuff like that. It's just that she doesn't because, you know, she never really needed to. Maybe she was prepared to defend her force if need be, but she never actually had to. And that actually goes up to like book 1, for example, where like, you know, well, not book 1, I think it's like book 6, book 4, like chapter 6 here as well. But yeah, basically right here. Essentially, it's like, you know, assumption, of course, the necessity of Florence size exists where in times of war or calamity, you know, they might teach each other. And you can probably get this from like a deal from book 4 that like, you know, essentially like, you know, Fay actually have like, you know, some like knowledge from like, you know, combat. It's just that she never actually had to use it before. And it's sort of like, you know, something highlight as well by seeing like, you know, the battle here. When we basically come across like, you know, her like first like, you know, interaction with the initiates, she says like, you know, they're not, you know, not holding their weapons properly. So even though she's basically like, you know, not very knowledgeable about weapons, it doesn't mean she's like, you know, lacking of it, and she knows like, you know, these guys aren't trained. The Zealots basically are trained. I gotta watch out for them. Like she actually knows what's basically going on, like, you know, in its like sort of combat scenario, without any knowledge basically like, you know, part of like, you know, being in an actual battle before. All right, well, I think it's basically sort of an important thing to sort of like, you know, include in the story. So that's it for it. And yeah, take care.